David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Contrary to this new movement about ideas and dialogue and platforming and hearing everybody out, I think it's important at some point to insert what should be a pretty obvious reality to us, which is that no matter what conversations you want to have or you choose to have or you enable the having of, you can't find middle ground with crazy people. Not every idea deserves to be part of the discussion. Not every person can be part of the solution. And some people and their ideas have to be ignored, have to be kept out of the discussion, or we are going to truly damage ourselves as a species, as a human society, as a country, however you want to slice and dice it. Now, before people go crazy and start writing in saying, David, you're calling for censorship, you're calling for mistreatment of people, you are limiting people's First Amendment rights and limiting what people have to say, I'm not. Okay, this came up last week during the interview I did with Joe Rogan in Los Angeles. There's lots of great things about this movement of the last several years that says it wants to hear all ideas and it wants to figure out what's best and have in-depth discussions with people from all sides of the political spectrum. That's great. Okay, I've been doing it for 10 years on the show. Dialogue is good. Discourse is critical to human advancement. A diverse range of opinions should be heard and considered and evaluated when we are trying to figure out as humans what is best for our future and what's best for our societies. But there are people out there with outrageously extreme bad ideas, and it's okay to put the line somewhere and say, you don't get a seat at the table. We're going to figure this thing out without you because your ideas are terrible and crazy and dangerous in some cases. Now, of course, the devil is in the details. And who is it that gets that sort of gatekeeping power? That's a real question. But during the Joe Rogan interview, I pointed out, I'm one of the biggest advocates of conversations with people we disagree with, respectful debate, the marketplace of ideas, responsible platforming of extremism even. But that at a certain point, you can't have reasonable conversations with some people. I gave the example. If we're trying to figure out what the top marginal tax rate should be in modern Western countries like ours that have economic systems that depend on government revenue already, what role is there for someone who thinks all taxes are government slavery, right? You have to do the responsible thing and not give that person a seat at the table when it comes down to actually making policy. Okay, you want to do a TV show and have someone from the taxes or slavery camp, do it. You want to have an academic debate about taxation, bring the taxes or slavery people. But when we're trying to figure this out in the serious legislative sense, does that person demand or rather deserve a seat at the table? No, it's just an interruption. It's going to get in the way of actually figuring things out. When we're trying to figure out the issue of it being legal still now in 2019 in a bunch of states to fire people based on their sexual orientation, real or perceived sexual orientation, should a lawmaker or a voter who believes that gay people should be put to death have a seat at the table in that conversation? No, it would be irresponsible. It would be ridiculous to give that person a seat at the table. There's nothing wrong with this, okay? It's called modern society. In philosophy, there's something called the Hegelian dialectic. It's named after Hegel, a German philosopher from the late 18th, early 19th century. And the basic idea of the Hegelian dialectic is that the process of change comes from, the process of figuring things out, maybe is a better way of saying it. It comes from a thesis and then an antithesis or an antithesis, and then a synthesis of the two into some kind of path forward. The underlying idea is that we're constantly merging opposed ideologies that will get us closer to an ideal or a solution or perfection of some kind, to use a utopian idealistic term. This doesn't work with outrageous, bad faith, ignorant, or cognitively limited people and horrible ideas, period. We need to stop going so far into the marketplace of ideas to the point where it becomes self-destructive, destructive rather. When we mandate that all ideas be considered equally and given equal footing, we are actually ceding ground to extremism. And this is not a hypothetical. This is how the right has won many victories. If eventually the solution is going to end up as the midpoint or the average or the mean of all ideas, by presenting the most extreme possible ideas, you pull the average to your side. Republicans know this. The right knows this, and they've used it successfully. If the debate over abortion is about up until what point in a pregnancy should abortion be legal, and we sort of concede that we're going to end up in the middle of all of the suggestions that we get, the anti-abortion right is incentivized to straight up say all abortions should be illegal. At 1 day of pregnancy, abortion is illegal. And if we guarantee that crazy position a seat at the table, they win by suggesting the craziest possible idea and pulling the Overton window, pulling the average of the debate over to their side. If the debate over the highest marginal tax rate is going to end up as the average of all the proposed ideas, the right benefits by saying the tax rate should be zero or taxation is slavery because it pulls the average towards them. I wish Democrats had understood this longer ago. If they had decided not to cede a ton of ground to Republicans trying to negotiate over things that Republicans simply will not negotiate about, we would be far better off today. If you do a show and you want to hear out wacky ideas, do it. I do it on this show, as long as I'm prepared to responsibly do it, pushing back against them, giving an opposing view. But when we're trying to have the serious conversations, we don't have any responsibility to let just any crazy old notion into the discussion. When a new plane is being developed, there's a cutoff as to what ideas Boeing or Airbus allow into the discussion and who is allowed to contribute to the plane's design. Anything else would be ridiculous. When we consider the best treatment for a medical condition, not every crazy notion is given the same value. This is logical. It shouldn't be different with politics. This isn't censorship. Everyone can say whatever they want. Say it on YouTube. Go to your local city council meeting and say it. Write a letter to your elected officials. Do a podcast, whatever. But you can't negotiate with crazy people and their crazy ideas, and they don't have to be given a seat at the big boy table, and that's okay, period. Let me know if you disagree. Donald Trump hilariously said yesterday that the difference between him and Nixon is that Nixon left and Trump is not going to leave. And this is hilarious because it implies that the difference is not that Nixon did bad things and Trump didn't. It implies that the difference is not that Nixon committed crimes and Donald Trump didn't. If you have some sense of Watergate, you probably have realized by now that the current Trump situation is actually worse than Watergate in many ways. Trump and Nixon both fired people to try to stop investigations into them. That's obstruction. Both Nixon and Trump dangled pardons, often through attorneys, in front of people in different ways and otherwise tried to influence witnesses to lie. The Mueller report, just like the Watergate roadmap, outlines the wrongdoing by Trump as the other document did with Richard Nixon. But there's a huge way in which Trump 2019 is worse than Nixon 1974, which is that in 1974, Republicans eventually came around and realized that Nixon had to go. 2019 Republicans are way more partisan and amoral than Republicans in 1974, and it makes the entire situation far worse than 1974 because we have an entire party, with a few exceptions, very few, that's not going to hold Donald Trump accountable. So then in comes Trump, more and more talk of impeachment, more and more demand for an impeachment inquiry in the House of Representatives. And yesterday, Trump decides it's time to draw a line, draw a distinction between him and Nixon in 74, who, of course, resigned before Republicans and Democrats could impeach him, which they were going to. And Trump yesterday says, after repeating the normal no collusion, no obstruction stuff, that the difference between him and Nixon is that Nixon eventually left and Donald Trump will not leave, does not leave. Check it out.
You can't impeach somebody when there's never been anything done wrong. We have a no collusion. We have no anything. There's no obstruction. There's no collusion. There's no anything. When you look at past impeachments, whether it was President Clinton or I guess President Nixon never got there. He left. I don't leave. There's a big difference. I don't leave. We did nothing wrong except create the greatest economy in the history of our country.
Now I get it. Trump's not saying he did something wrong. he's, if anything, implying Nixon did nothing wrong either, but left anyway because of pressure, and Trump, having done nothing wrong as far as he's concerned, is not going to leave. That being said, I agree. The main differences between Nixon and Trump are that, number one, Nixon was much smarter, and that Nixon eventually left, whereas Trump's ego and narcissism will probably prevent him from ever choosing to leave, meaning it's going to be up to us to remove him, which most efficiently will happen 17 months from now, less than 17 months from now, in November of 2020, when we have that election and can vote him out. Because even though Trump is insisting on no collusion, no obstruction, there's this hint of truth in what Donald Trump says. Nixon got caught. Nixon accepted responsibility. I won't, Donald Trump is saying. Now, there is one other interpretation here. Trump has this projection tendency where he often blames the other for doing what he did, or he says the opposite of what he's actually thinking. So lots of examples of Trump saying he has full confidence in a particular staffer's work, and then that staffer is fired a week later. Many examples of that. So the other interpretation here is that Trump is, in a sense, projecting by even bringing up the idea that Nixon left and I won't leave. It's a signal that Trump is actually starting to think about leaving. I don't know. And by the way, in July of 1973, Nixon also said that he wasn't going to leave. In the New York Times, check this out, from July 20th, 1973, a report. President Nixon emerged from the hospital today, pale but combative, and immediately denounced suggestions that he resign as just plain poppycock. Interpreting for the vocabulary of the time, this is what Donald Trump is saying today. I'm not going to go. Nixon, of course, eventually did, and maybe Donald Trump will as well. It's another criminal president talking about how he would never resign until Nixon actually resigned. If you're Trump, and so far you've gotten away with everything, it does make sense to just say, I'm not leaving, period, if and until something changes. And that's up to us. The best path forward, I've outlined it now for several weeks. An impeachment inquiry should immediately start in the House of Representatives. The point of it is not to actually remove Trump, because it won't. We're not going to get Republicans between now and November of 2020 to remove Donald Trump via impeachment. The point of the impeachment inquiry is to damage Trump by exposing the content of the Mueller report, to turn voters against Donald Trump so that they will ultimately vote him out in November of 2020, period. That is the best path forward. If you disagree, let me know. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Follow us both and let me know what you think.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Craig Leaner, and a second new member of the day is Thorfinn Stainforth. Thanks to both Craig and Thorfinn, we're doing two new members of the day, thanks to a really great problem to have, which is just the huge influx of new members that we've seen recently, including, by the way, since my appearance on the Joe Rogan program. Also want to say thanks to Laura Goldberg. Laura is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Laura's been with us almost 5 years, since 2014. Join Craig, Thorfinn, and Laura at www.joinpakman.com. The normal membership prices are very fair, I believe, but you can lower them by 40% using the coupon code THISIS2020, which will drop any membership, yearly, monthly, whatever you want, by 40%. You'll get 100% of the member benefits, but at a 40% reduced cost. On Friday, I'm going to talk about Joe Biden's recent campaign strategy, if you can even call it that, of sort of laying low and not being super public. But today I want to update you about polling, since it's been about almost 2 weeks since I last did. And it's actually more bad news for Joe Biden. Joe Biden's polls keep dropping. We're going to put the trajectory up on the screen for our video audience. And the story has been that before announcing his candidacy, Joe Biden was polling around the mid-20s up to the high 20s. And then eventually Joe Biden announced and said, I'm actually running for president. And that spiked up to higher than 40% support for Joe Biden. But since then, it hasn't been so good, and there's been a regular trailing off of Joe Biden. Last time I talked about this, Joe Biden's polling had trailed down to about 35 or 36%, and the last week has seen more drops to an average of between 33 and 34% for Joe Biden. Now, a quick note here before we continue the analysis. If you never believed that Joe Biden was polling as high as he was a month ago because the polls are supposedly fake, which I don't believe, right? But if you believe that, then you should also not believe that Joe Biden's polling has been trailing off. It's sort of weird to see the same people that say the polling is totally fake now cite the polling as evidence that Joe Biden is losing support. It's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. It's like Trump saying the employment numbers are fake under Obama, but they're real under him, and an indicator that the economy is doing really well. Doesn't work, okay? So don't do that. But in any case, who has been gaining from Joe Biden's polling drops? Bernie Sanders has seen a slight uptick into the high teens. Elizabeth Warren has seen a very small uptick, but most recently it's actually been Pete Buttigieg who has been climbing in the polls, and very slightly Kamala Harris. A lot of people are still just going nowhere. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard continuing to poll about 0.5%, unable to get it to move. Jay Inslee, Tim Ryan, John Delaney, Bullock, Gillibrand, Williamson, they can't even get to 1%. But there have been two sort of major opposing views on the Biden drop and what's causing Biden's decline. One view is Biden staying out of the public eye is hurting him because people are forgetting about him and people aren't supporting him because they just aren't aware of his presence. The other view is that since Joe Biden publicly announced, more people are understanding his platform and they don't like it. And thus people who thought, oh, well, I kind of like the idea of Biden, it's sort of reminiscent of the Obama era, as they learn about Joe Biden's platform, they are moving away from Joe Biden. Either or both could be true, or neither, depending on who you're talking about, which part of the country you're talking about. But in the immediate, the question becomes the debates and Iowa being the first primary or caucus. The reality is that Iowa depends on relatively few voters, and Biden is still doing well in Iowa, although he is trailing off there in the same way that he has been nationally. Here's my advice to you if you don't like the way this primary is shaking up, in terms of the people that are getting more attention, in terms of the people that are leading the polls, to the extent that you believe the polls, and generally I think the polls are a pretty good picture of what's going on. Don't get mad at the polls and the fact that a candidate you don't like might be leading, okay? Campaign for and be an activist for whoever you think is the best candidate, period. And soon the debates will start, and we'll start to get a sense of whether the numbers move. We'll start to get a sense of how people who are going to be voting in the Democratic primary are actually reacting to these candidates in real time, particularly not just to their ideas, but to how they relate to other candidates that are on the stage. The reality is that historically, in general, in June of the year before an election, which is where we are now, this is like June of 2015 relative to the 2016 election. This is like June of 2011 relative to the 2012 election. June of 2019 in the context of the 2020 election. The polls are pretty good at telling us who is likely to win the nomination historically. We'll see if something is different this time around, but that is a reality that we have to contend with and we have to accept. At this point in time, generally speaking, the winner of the primary is going to be someone who is already polling relatively well. Doesn't have to be the number one person, but it's extraordinarily unlikely that it is going to be someone who's polling below 2 or 3% at this point in time. If you disagree, let me know. Give me an example. This is so annoying that I even have to do this next segment, but I want to just do it and get it on the record so that every time people ask me, did you see what Sam Cedar or Anna Kasparian or whoever said about you, David? We can hopefully short circuit a lot of those conversations. It's become really trendy for some of the progressive media audience to go around effectively tattletaling to other shows and getting them to react to what other people are saying and then playing that back off of the original host or off of some other person. So I'll give you an example of how this nonsense works. I say something. Someone calls into Sam Cedar and says, Sam, did you see what David Pakman said? Then they take Sam's reaction, to something that, by the way, Sam has not seen. And then they go to some third host and they say, hey, did you see what Sam Seder said about what David Pakman said? And then they call into my show 10 days later and they say, David, did you see what so-and-so said about what so-and-so said about what you said now 10 or 14 days ago? But the real problem is not the tattling. Like, okay, it's fine. There's this kind of progressive media environment where a lot of the hosts are in touch and we're sort of sharing an audience to some degree. The problem is that people are misquoting me endlessly and wasting everybody's time. And I'm going to play an example for you here, okay? I was on the Joe Rogan program in Los Angeles last week. In that interview, I said that the left needs to be careful about defining itself too narrowly and starting to exclude ideas or people that are reasonable ideas or reasonable people. And I gave the example of different ways of getting health care for everybody. And I pointed out that expanding Medicare to include everyone in a Medicare for all system is one idea, and it's a good idea, but that there are lots of other ideas that I'm open to. These all would be systems of universal coverage. Many are single payer. But my point was, it could look more like Canada. It could look more like the UK or France or Germany, although I don't think that the Singapore system is exactly the best path forward. There are elements of the Singapore system that are interesting. But my point was, all of these systems are better than ours. Let's not shut out good ideas or exclude people who have other ways to get to real, universal, total health coverage for anybody. So a caller went to Sam Seder, completely misstated my position as being for a public option, which is like the softest, most right-wing modification we could make to the system we have, and asked Sam Seder to react to that, which of course is not what I actually said. This is a waste of time. Now, of course, Sam said, I don't know what David said, but more importantly, now Sam is responding to something I never actually said, and we all lose when this happens. We're fighting ideas that I didn't even put forward. Let's take a look at it.
Hey, Sam, this is Nick from Seattle.
Nick, what's on your mind?
All right, just on the David Pakman, Joe Rogan thing. So David Pakman's an overall good commentator. I don't analyze those I mostly agree with, though there were some pretty terrible takes on Ilhan Omar that I have trouble getting over.
I didn't see
regardless, with Joe.
Let's actually stop there just briefly. There's another example. My terrible takes on Ilhan Omar, where I called her anti-Semitic, is typically the way this goes, which I never did. I must have said 25 times now. I did not say Ilhan Omar is anti-Semitic. I did not say that what Ilhan Omar said is inherently anti-Semitic. I said merely there are many examples of this same historically anti-Semitic trope of Jewish conspiracy to control, and what Ilhan Omar said referred to that, period. Okay, that's it. I didn't say she was anti-Semitic. I didn't say what she said is anti-Semitic, period. And yet endlessly, I'm having to respond to critiques for things I didn't say. But let's not go to that one because we have a different one that we're dealing with. So let's get back to the Sam Seder show.
But anyways, regardless, with Joe Rogan, he made a concession that the left is too absolute, specifically on the topic of Medicare for all. I want to hear what you guys think of this take. Seems like he's open to the type of plan Liz Warren has also been flirting with, as she also steps away from Medicare for all. I want to know what you guys think of that.
Characterize that plan, because I didn't. What did Pakman say?
I think he's open to the public option, things like that. He says that the left is too absolute about wanting just Medicare for all. He thinks that there's other plans that we can go with in regards to solving the Medicare issue.
I mean, I don't.
I'm not even going to play Sam's response because I didn't say what the caller wants Sam to react to. I've not stepped away from Medicare for all. I haven't said that what I want is a public option, which is so lame. I've not said any of it. What's the point in getting Sam to react to something I didn't say? I've been at the forefront of this issue on healthcare for a decade, for as long as I've been doing the show. There's no upside to the movement to going to Sam Seder and getting him to react to a position that is not mine. Single payer doesn't have to mean Medicare for all. When you look at all the systems that are better than ours, whether it's Canada or the UK, Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, France, whatever, they aren't all single payer. Many of them are, but in all of them, the government plays a major role as both a regulator and a funder through taxation. The private sector often still exists to different degrees. Some places you still have private insurance as an option that's available if you want it. To different degrees, private industry is still running hospitals or some clinics or whatever. Everybody has to have coverage no matter what system they have. You need that to have the largest possible risk pool. You could argue that the German system might more easily build on what we have in a more immediate way. That would be a respectable position. The French system is great, but 90% of the population has something beyond the national system. What elements of that might make sense? In any case, the point is, we are wasting time when we do this. When I say A and a caller goes to Sam and says, Sam, David Pakman said B, react to it. And Sam says, well, based on B, I think C. I never said B, okay? So C is pointless. It's a waste of time. Let's stop doing it, okay? Let's stop the tattling. Let's actually work productively here to improve our country, to improve the society around us, and not waste anybody's time with this nonsense. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. While you're there, follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. Lots of behind-the-scenes pictures and memes and all sorts of stuff from my trip to Los Angeles last week, during which I appeared on the Joe Rogan program, an interview that now, it's actually doing really well. It has surpassed a ton of these MMA folks that Joe Rogan sometimes interviews, and even some of the political folks in only the first 5 days. I think 1.2 million views now for the main Joe Rogan interview, which was 2 hours. So make sure you watch it, keep sharing it, keep refreshing, because we want to get those numbers up as high as possible. And more exciting announcements, by the way, coming up very soon.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program today Richard Wolff, who is, of course, Professor Emeritus of Economics at my undergraduate alma mater, the University of Massachusetts, currently a visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. The latest book, called Understanding Marxism, is available all of the normal places, including in digital form. Professor Wolff, great to have you on again.
Glad to be here, David. Really am.
So let's start digging into some of the ideas that we are seeing put forward by the 2020 Democratic challengers. On the one hand, we've sort of seen the mainstreaming of some ideas that even as recently as 4 years ago were considered relatively niche and left, including a wealth tax, including Medicare for all in a sort of more serious and particular way. What's your overall sense of this shift? And do you think that there is any policy in particular that goes far enough in terms of the type of systemic change that may be needed? Or are we really still talking about sort of Band-Aids and fixing things around the edges?
Well, I basically think, to get to the core of your question, that we are still seeing the vast preponderance of proposals from the Democratic contenders. Those are Band-Aids, that's right. Those are the attempt to see honestly, and certainly better than the Republicans can manage, what the failures and flaws and problems of our economic and political system are. But I do think it's still early in the process of facing up to all of it, so that they are mostly Band-Aids. They are mostly attempts to take what we already have some of and make it more comprehensive, make it more generous, and hope against hope, really, that these adjustments will somehow be adequate. What I do find remarkable, and I see it in the shifting over to Medicare for all and taxing the wealth, there is the beginning of an understanding that these Band-Aids have to go further than one used to think Band-Aids had to go. that it wasn't just a little tweaking of the tax rates and so forth, but something as fundamental as imposing a tax on wealth itself in the form of stocks and bonds, which this country has avoided doing for most of its history. So it is a recognition that we need more, and yet a hope that relatively modest things will be sufficient to what? To change what's going on. I think that's the really interesting thing, that capitalism in America has now produced such an extreme level of inequality, such an extreme experience of capitalism's instability, the crash of 2008, the 10 years we've just lost trying, quote unquote, to recover from it. The fact that the entire financial community knows that either this year or next year we're going to have a recession, and who knows how bad this one will be. All of this roiling of the realities we live in is pushing our politics on the right over toward Mr. Trump and all that he represents, but on the left in the directions that your question raises.
I saw a critique of that you were involved in some way, shape, or form. I forget exactly on what show, related to the idea of universal basic income, sort of in the mode that Andrew Yang has been proposing it. And I've talked about this a lot, including with him, and I have some problems with the particulars. But to sort of paraphrase, and I hope I'm doing it correctly, one of your more general criticisms was that giving people $1,000 a month is not going to solve a lot of the structural issues that exist regarding inequality, regarding the relationship between most workers and their employers, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that that was a good critique, but I wondered, couldn't the same opposition be cited against food stamps, against WIC, et cetera, et cetera? And it doesn't strike me as a reason not to do it, as long as we sort of recognize its limitations, so to speak. So I guess to clarify, are you against something like universal basic income, period? Like, are you against doing it? Or is it merely that you want to make sure that we understand that it's not structurally changing the problems of the system?
It's mostly the latter. I don't oppose doing these things any more than I oppose, giving welfare to people who are denied a job. But because the liberal part of American politics has long ago given up the critique of the structure, the notion of basic change, the whole debate of the 20th century about capitalism versus socialism, which, by the way, is coming back now. But because the liberals gave up on it, people like me have to hammer at the inadequacy of these Band-Aids, lest the idea be that we either have no Band-Aid or we have a Band-Aid, but that something beyond the Band-Aid is somehow unthinkable or undiscussable. So I want to point out that, for example, if you give everybody a guaranteed basic income, but some people go to work and have a job and earn way more than all of that, you're just inviting what our own history shows us, which is sooner or later the people who work for an living will be, how shall I put it politely, helped to see the people who get the guaranteed income as, in some sense, living off the taxes they pay. And therefore, the tension between the employed and the unemployed that has always dogged capitalism will simply resurface in an adjusted form around the question of a basic income. Therefore, I would much rather face the reality, which is, if we have technological change that makes it possible for fewer people to be more productive than they used to be, so that instead of needing 100 workers to make something, we only need 50, we can cut the labor cost in half, capitalism solves that problem in a particular way. It fires half the people.
Right.
Why? Because then you can produce the same amount with half the people, sell it, let's presume for simplicity, at the same price. And what you get as revenue, you now don't have to pay half the workers you used to. You keep that money as your profit, which is why the technological change attracts you in the first place. But that's the capitalist answer, but it oughtn't to be ours. Why? because the alternative way of handling a doubling in productivity, which is what we've just discussed, would be to give everybody half the amount of hours per day to work. That way, everybody keeps their job, everybody keeps their income. What the benefit of technology is what we really always promised people, namely leisure. And in a society not driven by profit, that the technology would be advanced because the gain is to the majority in more leisure rather than the gain to a minority in the way of more profit. These are the questions that are structural and basic, and these are the ones that still remain a bit too scary for virtually all of the candidates in the Democratic Party to get a hold of.
Yeah, I actually did a commentary yesterday about the latest jobs numbers, and I said it's fine to talk about 75,000 versus the expected number. It's fine to talk about 0.2% wage growth versus 0.5, but fundamentally, none of this stuff is actually addressing these incoming and growing issues of the relationship of humans to work. And my analysis of the 100 employees versus 50 due to the technological change has been, and I wonder if you agree with it, that the pure free market capitalist reception of that technological change that allows you to double productivity would be you fire half the workers. And that's also bad for other elements of the economy, because now you have 50 workers that no longer have money with which to buy things from other businesses. The pure socialist solution might be, well, we've socialized ownership of the company to begin with, so the workers share in all the gains. Now, here's where I wonder if we disagree. The social democracy solution might be the business owners are entitled to some piece of that productivity gain, whereas some significant portion would be divided up by the workers. Is that fair? Is that pie in the sky?
No, I think that's a perfectly reasonable step. I mean, it assumes something, namely that the owners are in some sense different from the people who are working there.
Yes.
If you really change the system, that difference would disappear. But let's keep it for a while. Let's assume that there are owners or capitalists on the one hand and workers on the other. It would be an enormous step forward, I would agree, to have a discussion in which the question is raised, okay, we now have a technical advance. We can install that here in the business we have, and that gives us what? It gives us a choice. We can either use all of it for profit and fire half the workers, or we can use none of it for profit and give all the workers basically a half-time employment situation at the same wage. Or, and this is simple arithmetic, we can split the difference. We can have a conversation, a discussion, maybe a vote as to what portion of the gains from a technological advance are given to workers in the form of leisure versus employers in the form of profits. That already would be a level of the democratization of the workplace, which is what I stress anyway, would be a major step forward. And by the way, while this is a revolutionary idea here in the United States,
right,
social democracies in Europe, this is not a new idea. This is, in fact, what goes on in Germany and France and Italy. Unions often are bargaining with employers on precisely how to divide technical and other kinds of advances in terms of sharing, in a sense, in the benefits. It's not revolutionary. It's not challenging the private ownership of the industries and the enterprises, but it is saying that what happens with an advance of technology is something that has to be discussed and worked out like everything else about the workplace, and not something simply to be determined to the advantage of one side and the exclusion of participation on the other.
Well, that gets me to something else I want to hear your thoughts on, which is that there's a very specific and productive, I think, debate to be had about capitalism versus socialism, social democracy versus unregulated capitalism, et cetera. But are you concerned about what I have seen as sort of some confusion between social democracy and socialism? I've done a number of segments where I'm saying, if we even really want to seriously have this debate, we have to make sure that we're calling things what they are. And socialism, where the means of production is socialized, is different than something like the Swedish system or the Danish system, which is a capitalist system that says we are going to use more of the government revenue to ensure that the standard of living doesn't go below a certain level. Is that an academic distinction, or is that a serious distinction that we need to understand to really talk about this stuff?
I could not be more 100% the latter and not the former. In other words, this is not academic or abstract or nitpicking or anything like that. This is of the essence. And that's part of our backwardness here in the United States. For a half a century after the end of World War II, socialism, communism, Marxism, all of that was proscribed. It was declared traitorous. It was declared evil. It was whatever you want. And people were good Americans who kept away from it, didn't think about it, didn't read about it, didn't debate about it, nothing. And now that capitalism has shown itself to need basic change to an awful lot of people for whom it isn't working real well, there's a process of rediscovery. And that's all to the good. But in that process, you are right, the confusion and the misuse of language and the naming of things that really oughtn't to be named that way, because 100 years of literature and debate have clarified these differences, but Americans are just learning. Let me give you an example. 2 weeks ago, I was invited, and I did it, to be on the town hall of the Fox television system for an hour.
Yes.
Answering questions from a live audience, debating, by the way, Lou Dobbs and Neil Cavuto and all of those people. Sitting next to me, Herman Cain, the candidate for president, so that we had a debate. It was capitalism versus socialism. And there on display was this arresting fudge of words and ideas in which the same word, socialism, was applied to Sweden, to Italy, to China, to Russia, to Venezuela. I mean, the chaos and confusion that is being sown. Now, partly on the other side, they want to lump all of these things together.
Right.
I understand that. But if you're interested in these things as real options for a society in difficulty, which I am and many Americans are, that has to be clarified. And I think it's very good, even if it's difficult, that you begin to say, look, this is social democracy, or this is democratic socialism. This is something else to which we can give a variety of names that have been used. But we have to begin clarifying this so we can have the conversation and the political action focused on what it is we actually want.
Well, that's good. It makes me feel better that I haven't been wasting my time with those segments. We've been speaking with economist Richard Wolff. The new book is called Understanding Marxism. It's available everywhere you would imagine books are available. Professor Wolff, always great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you, David, and hope we can do it again soon.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So one of the biggest dividing lines, we could call it, between the American left and right is about what role should government have in our lives? How big should government be? What are the things that government should and shouldn't be doing? And the public policy mood estimate is a measure of exactly that. And it is at the most liberal point in the 68-year history of the measure. And it's really important to understand that this measure doesn't address the public's view on a lot of the issues that have been big parts of the Donald Trump administration. So immigration is not addressed by the public policy mood report. Trade is not in any way addressed by this. It's specifically related to the role and scope of government in society. And I have to tell you, the results are not actually very surprising, because when we look at individual issue polls where people are asked, should the government provide a basic level of health care to everybody, regardless of whether they can pay for it? The country is the most to the left that it has been on that issue. People, by and large, thinking the answer is yes, the government should provide some basic level of care to everybody, even if they can't pay for it. And part of the reason why is that whether your sympathies to that idea are ideological or moral or economic, we now realize that, hey, we're a rich enough country that we can be making sure everybody has a basic level of care. And it's also good economically because when people have access to health care, all sorts of other negative externalities are mitigated, like work absenteeism and productivity, if that is what you care about, or criminality related to needing money to pay for medical treatments, medical bankruptcies, all of that stuff. Whatever your sympathies are with regard to healthcare, more and more of the country now recognizes everybody's better off if the government does something that we can very easily afford to do, which is make sure everybody has some basic level of care. On the issue of taxation, should the government be using taxation to reduce income inequality by taxing the very, very rich? The country has moved to the left on that. It has been a significant and steady move to the left. Now, I know that there are still people who don't want the rich to be taxed. I know there are still people who believe that it's not good economically to tax the very, very rich, to lift the bottom end and make sure nobody gets left behind. You can find those people. Many of them voted for Trump. But in total, the country has moved to the left in terms of believing that that is a role that government should be playing. This is why Republicans don't want people to vote. When you understand and recognize that on the issues, the country is well to the left of our elected officials, you don't want people to vote. The ideas that people have come around to, and this is bigger than Trump, are more or less the ideas of Franklin D. Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights. FDR proposed this during his 1944 State of the Union address. The elements of it were employment, a Bill of Rights that contains employment, meaning the right to work, food, clothing, and leisure with enough income to support those activities. A farmer's right to a fair income. This was very important in the U.S. at the time. Freedom from unfair competition and monopolies. Elizabeth Warren is talking about this. Housing, medical care, social security, and education. This is from 1944. I would add to the Second Bill of Rights now, protecting the environment in the context of the climate crisis that we're facing. But this is all about government's role. And on government's role in total, the country is as left as it has ever been. So if we fix our election system, we might actually have a shot at making more of these things a reality, because the most liberal public mood ever is not going to get progressive politicians elected if we don't fix campaign finance, if we don't fix the election systems, if we don't stop voter suppression. This does also relate, by the way, to my story yesterday, pointing out that Donald Trump is mostly the result of decades of right-wing anti-intellectualism and demonization of progressive ideas. But Donald Trump's rise to power is also partially a result of milquetoast, centrist, status quo ideas from corporate Democrats for much of that same multi-decade period. So all these issues with campaign finance and voting systems do need to be fixed, but Democrats also need to get with it and move to the left, as some Democratic candidates for 2020 are finally starting to do, as some members of the Progressive House Caucus are finally starting to do. There's plenty of blame to go around. It's not everybody is equally to blame, but when you understand that on the issues the American public has moved to the left, it immediately becomes obvious why Republicans have been behaving the way they've been behaving when it comes to who is allowed to vote, what is required to vote, what are the number of places that people are allowed to vote, and why do they want to reduce that? And they have sporadically gone public and made it clear. Remember that guy, I think his name was Mike Turzai, who said voter ID will deliver Pennsylvania to Mitt Romney. They understand this, okay? They're willing to play dirty, and to a great extent, they have secured numerous, endless election victories as a result of their willingness to do it. Do Democrats need to stoop to the same level? Well, it's not stooping when you try to get more people to vote, okay? That's called the spirit of democracy, and we need to understand all of these elements. It's fantastic that the country is moving left. We just need to make it possible for that leftward move to be reflected in the elected officials that we put into power. And voter suppression, voter ID, reducing voting hours, reducing polling places, all of that is going to make it harder for the will of the people, which is more left than ever, to actually be made a reality. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a caller who apparently believes that me interviewing them is so important that I may end up judged by God on Judgment Day negatively if I don't interview them. Take a listen to this.
You will be held accountable for every soul that has missed the word of God because you didn't have me on your show. You understand that? You will be held accountable on Judgment Day.
Yeah. Very scary, very, very scary threat. And I guess that's something we should look into because the apocalypse can be pretty bad. I've heard about people being raptured, and it's both painful and embarrassing. We've got a great bonus show for you today. There has been a helicopter crash in New York City, and this actually relates to something I've been thinking of for a long time, which is just more generally the risk that aviation over the New York skyline represents. And when I lived in New York, I thought about this a lot, including with the landing pattern for LaGuardia Airport. We'll talk about that on the bonus show and get into detail about it. Also, the governor of Alabama has signed into law a chemical castration bill, which I want to discuss with you. And California will become the first state to extend health benefits to some people who are in the United States illegally. 3 really important stories, plus some more behind the scenes stuff that's going on the show, and lots of other interesting things. Get the bonus show. There's 2 ways to do it, at least 2 that I can think of offhand. Become a member at www.joinpacman.com. Coupon code, this is 2020, saves you 40%. You still get all the benefits, including the world famous daily bonus show on which we regularly hear from producer Pat. Become a patron at the $5 a month or greater level, patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Another way to get instant access to the David Pakman Show bonus show. And we will speak to you then. And otherwise, you'll have to wait until tomorrow, where there will be a really great show, including the return of Patriot Mail and much, much more. That's it for today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.